In fact, another person that should be mentioned is Hegel. We've mentioned him a couple of times before, but when people bash Hegel, they often do it for wrong reasons. So just to clarify, George Frederick Hegel was in favor of the state control. So those who bash him for, wanting a sort of an Orwellian sort of control state, they're right. But where they go wrong is why he wanted that. They talk, and then it gets very esoteric, and they merely bash him just because he happened to be into sort of, occultism or mysticism and all of that. They don't really get to the meat. And basically, and don't forget that Hegel himself was a Lutheran, by the way. He was also one of these sort of Calvinist stroke Lutheran types. And his particular philosophy is very interesting because he also believed that there was no such thing, Henrik, as the personal ego. And how he justified this is really fascinating. He believed that there is no personal ego, there's only a social ego. And it was to do with his philosophy and some of the debates he was having with philosophers at the time. In traditional philosophy and psychology, when you study the mind, you believe two capacities that are what I call axiomatic. Axiomatic means that it cannot be doubted. It's an absolute fact. For instance, like if you have a head in a mind, you must have a body. If there's an effect, it must have had a cause, and the effect always comes after a cause. All right, that's what's considered axiomatic. No amount of wrangling can change that. Whatever. Or like the sun is a particular color, it's always that color. That kind of thing. So in psychology and philosophy, it's always known that it's axiomatic to a certain extent that the mind operates in two ways. It has perceptions of the world. It understands that there's something out there called the phenomena of the world, and it also has the ability to analyze itself. Thinking, right, can think about thought. You can be aware of how you're thinking, and maybe you can even be aware that you're wrong in certain instances. So there's a certain capacity of mind to think about thought itself. So that means that, the mind has two levels of awareness. And this is what Hegel, in his philosophy, refuted. He said that no, there's actually a third capacity of the mind, because you cannot think about your own mind without considering how you as a person are viewed by other people. And this is like just in a nutshell. It's more elaborate than this, but I'm just making it very brief.
Right.
He said that whenever the human mind is thinking about mind, it's thinking of mind as other people see it. In other words, your vision of yourself is entirely based on considering that other people exist. So there's your third aspect then. You think about your own mind and you know that you exist, you know that the phenomena of the world exists, but you cannot think without having a consciousness that other people also exist in a very profound and deep way. And therefore that was the third aspect that Hegel brought to the table. And that's perfectly right. That's why I'm saying that the philosophy there is very solid. But what does that lead to? What he basically means, and don't forget that Hegel came before the Freuds and Jungs. That's why this is very important, because this would later be reiterated much more strongly and much more sort of user-friendly language by the psychologists who would come after him. But what Hegel was saying preempted Freud. He was basically saying that you are absolutely, your thought is completely aware of other people, and that your whole sense of identity and your ego is colored by each of us. We're all doing it. So in Hegel's thought, he then went even further and said, hey, there isn't any individuality at all. All there is the social persona and the social consciousness. And that then leads to the fact that society is more important than the individual.
Right.
You see how the connection then comes about?
Right, exactly. Yep.
And this is how then the lead gets taken on. So he says that, look, man is born from man and woman, right? You from the moment you're born, you're in company. Every society on this face of this planet, I don't care from the savage levels onwards, they've always lived in communities. Man does not like to be alone. He's born from other human beings. He has uncles and aunts and brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers. He has extended friends. He has societies. And he looks to being in society as being a good thing. And therefore, it's only one step away, isn't it, from serving that society, serving that society is good. You see how we have the Calvinism and then the behaviorism coming in?
Yeah. And
this global, what we're trying to say is, let's look at the philosophies that lead up to this global village mentality. And if you're infected by it, you're walking their, conveyor belt, whether you like to admit it or not. And in Hegel's reading was that man should be then subservient to the social hive, And anyone who appears to be or wants to be an outsider is actually deranged. In his reading of things, then, if you try to be too much of an individual, an outsider, you are the one with a problem. And this is what we see today when people are having problems by trying to do that. He would have thought, you see, that, well, let's put it this way. He would have said that if you're an outsider, it's not because you really, really, really want to be individual. It's because for some reason or another, you know, you got pimples on your face, or you're too fat, or you're just a bit of a thicko, or you're, you know, dark-skinned, or you're not, you know, handsome enough or eloquent enough. You're only an outsider because society hasn't accepted you on your own terms like you would be. So you're not really truly an outsider. You're more a sort of a malcontent. But given a chance, you just love to be part of that society. So this, again, is very important, too, that you have to define the outsider. Is the outsider one who really wants to break away and be individual, and he sees the reasons, he sees, and he's conscious of the things he doesn't like? Or he's actually a jaded guy or girl who just can't wait to be embraced, you know, by the collective?
That's incredible. And I wanted to ask you, Michael, because this seems, again, touch a little bit into the fact of what you talked about human beings being turned into to robots pretty much as well, because if the mentality is like a robot, it doesn't really matter what comes down the line, so to speak. But what we're seeing is the extension now even of this in one way, the scientific approach to this, and that the humans don't have any consciousness, etc. Is this transhumanist movement, which is the extension of the scientific model, pretty much, where we're totally removed from all kinds of humanity. You know,
this is how it works. Because all of these philosophers ultimately then looked to this. They looked to this because you have to give purpose and meaning then to those people in the social hive. Once you've given over your selfhood to the social hive, well, that social hive has to have some sort of purpose, doesn't it? The ants are doing something, you know, all the time. There's activity. But let's look at another incredible aspect of this. These outsiders who are then living, they're going to be in continual state of existential anxiety, and it's not healthy, authentic anxiety. It's the anxiety that's created by you. Well, it's the conflict that arises between you trying to maintain your own ideas against those of the collective, which is exactly what you see when you see anyone in this world. Say, for instance, the teenagers, you know, or anybody. They're going to be in perpetual conflict just by doing that. So what's the result? The result is the danger that people cannot live with that type of depression and that conflict, and then they give themselves over to the mass because it's just too much stress to, you know, have that tension between your own ideas that make you an individual, which is very hard to come by. You have to go through a big wasteland experience. If you leave the collective for a while, you might rush back because it's quite, you know, bleak before you've actually found the road to the true you, you know, before you get into your dharma. It can sometimes be a period of loneliness that people don't like that, and then they rush back.
Yeah.
And then there's something even more sinister. Let's never forget the limbic and the emotional component of all of this. When man cannot be individual, because like Hegel says, it's a truism that your individuality is innately tied up with visions of other people and their visions of you and the approval rating and all of these kinds of things, then you are living, as time goes by, as history passes, you actually are constantly living with the feeling that you're not whole. You are not individual. And so then your mind starts creating this sort of fictional, analog individual self. It's part of the reason why we like to watch movies with Clint Eastwood and Arnold Schwarzenegger and other sort of movies of that ilk, where you have these big guys, you know, the big projected Superman types, who then represent that feeling of he's the stranger. He's the strong individual person who thinks for himself. He's monotone and so forth and so on. There's even one more interesting thing to go into here, because of course by Hegel's definition that society is all good and your allegiance to it is all good, by the same definition that your ego is basically a social ego, what happens if the society that he's talking about is basically the source of evil? He may or may not have admitted this, but just for argument's sake, what happens if the Hegelian populace, the Hegelian unit of society is a corrupting influence? Then instantaneously you immediately see that there's going to be a negative effect on the consciousness of those human beings, because there's such a inviolable identification going on. they're literally one and the same thing to Hegel. Your idea of yourself, what you call the I-ness, is a social I-ness. And therefore, whatever happens in society, say something aberrant starts happening in society, you automatically are going to be infected with that in some sort of Star Trek, way in which you're not even going to be aware of it, like some sort of Quatermass way in which you're literally magnetized and roped in. And so whatever society does, you are going to be affected or infected, you see, by that very pestilence. This is another huge problem here. And I'd say also that I talked about Freud coming later. Hegel's model is Freudian to a point, because the social ego, as we said, is created by society. Now, remember that all psychologists, this is what people like all philosophers do not talk about repression.
Okay.
Right? This is a difference between the two schools. In psychology, you hear about a fascinating capacity of the ego, which is called repression, which means that the parts that cause you pain, the parts of yourself that you don't like, anything that would cause conflict and stress, the mind has an ability to repress it into what's known as the unconscious, and so that you can have a sort of homeostasis of the ego, so it can function, right? Okay, so then backtrack and fuse together the Freudian model of repression and the ego and Hegel, and you have something absolutely incredible. And Freud would agree, but for different reasons. If the state and if the system, the populace, is controlling your sense of identity, then isn't it going to be the force that demands what it is that you repress about yourself?
Yeah.
Because again, in the psychological model, you are basically the one who sort of decides, right? But if you tie in the Hegelian aspect, no, it's everyone that you've met, everyone that has an influence of your life, including the people in the world, the whole matrix out there, the whole human collectivism is the very thing that is policing people to repress aspects of themselves so that they conform to this mechanical, technological, because the word technology means more than just machines. It's a way of thinking. And so that kind of indoctrination then causes the Freudian forms of repression. And this is extremely important to understand, because anything that is antithetical to the mores, and the likes and dislikes of the society will then have to be repressed. And in Freudian terms, it's the superego that handles this. It's a part of the ego that censors and represses any undesirable content. And the reason why it's undesirable is because it causes you pain. Well, what causes people more pain than not being accepted by their fellows or feeling always like an outsider?
Yeah.
So this is if it turns out that the only definition of consciousness is not that you have a personal ego, but that it's purely collectivized, and the behaviors believe this. The Calvinists in their own way believe this, because they're collective. And if the Hegelians and the global village people all believe this, then you can understand now why we're heading towards this Walden 2 situation. There is no consciousness at all.
Yeah.
There's only mechanism, machine. And any concept of selfhood that you even have is utterly subservient to the social hive, to their social conditioning, and anything about yourself that doesn't correspond or is frowned upon, you see, or doesn't gel with, is not part of the acculturated self, is going to be repressed. And the final component of this is even more fascinating, because don't forget that the Freudian perspective on the unconscious was different than Carl Jung's.
Yeah.
And it's different in this way. Freud believed that everything that is in the unconscious is put there during this individual life. Okay. It's really a pre-conscious dumpster of just this life that you've lived.
Okay, yeah.
So this is his definition. And that definition, of course, became slightly adapted or slightly modified by Carl Jung, who said, no, the unconscious is actually a reservoir that is programmed over millennia by all human beings' existences.
Right,
it's a collective unconscious, okay?
Yeah.
Then still bear in mind what we've been talking about with Hegel and Freud. But you just change Freud's understanding that it's not a dumping ground of this life, it's the dumping ground of all mankind. So it's bigger. That means physically and energetically that the so-called unconscious is vast. It's a bigger thing. It has greater magnitude than the little ego that is the censoring apparatus, that sort of peaks up above the waters, so to speak, and interfaces with this world. And then you even go further than that, and you go into other people's definitions of the unconscious, people like the Taoists, the Native American Indians, even philosophers like Martin Heidegger, and they insist that the unconscious is even yet more than that. The unconscious is the place which your true self, right? Not the persona we've been describing, not the social sense of I-ness, but the true self, your true selfhood, which embodies your connection to divinity, which embodies your connection to nature. When you were once upon a time in ancient times guided by nature, and nature was your guide, and you didn't have a subjective sense of self in the same ludicrous way that we have today, when nature was your guide and you were in harmony with the universe. These people are even saying that part of you that is called the unconscious is where that is. That is where your so-called spirit and soul and self and your intelligence, your higher forms of intelligence, your deeper senses, that's where that is. So if that is the case, and I personally believe that is the case, and that's why it's very important to open up to the unconscious in whatever way that person can manage this, then we start to see, by again flipping it over and coming back to the Hegelian paradigm, what the global village mentality is trying to do, what the religions are trying to do. They're trying to make you as outer directed as possible. They're trying to make you as mechanical as possible. They're trying to make you as subservient to consensus trance as possible, for one reason and one reason only: to pull you further and further into your ego. And I don't even mean a healthy ego. I mean Hegel's definition of it, the public ego, the impersonal ego, or one might even say the malignant narcissistic ego. You see, there's all sorts of ways you can look at this. The non-self, whatever you want to call it. By pulling a man away from that, you are murdering true individualism. But you can't do that, Henrik, without giving something equally alluring on the outside. It doesn't work unless you have the carrot as well. What greater travesty, what greater mutilation, what greater act of violence can you do than separating a man from his own selfhood?